I often get comments that statins are safe and effective. Well, any medication may be safe for some and unsafe for others, and same thing with effectiveness. So we're going to explore that today by looking into numbers needed to treat from an independent source. Stay tuned. The first distinction we have to make is the difference between the effectiveness or safety of the drug and the safety of the therapy. This is a subtle distinction, but it makes a big difference. So please hear me out before you run to the comments and say, no, you're all wrong about that. Listen to the complete story. First of all, there's the effectiveness of the medication. And an example of that is from this famous Lipitor ad where they say that Lipitor reduces the risk of heart attack by 36%. That is a relative risk reduction. So in round numbers, we'll just look at it like this. If there were 3 people standing in front of a doctor, and that doctor knew for certain that those 3 people were going to have a heart attack if they weren't treated, and he gave each of them statins, one of those heart attacks would be avoided. It is effective to that degree. The problem is we're rarely in that situation, and we really need to know what is the effectiveness of the therapy. Well, what do I mean by the therapy? I mean the entire context in which the statins are given. And that's actually captured by 2 numbers, the absolute risk reduction and the number needed to treat, which is just the inverse of the absolute risk reduction. If the absolute risk reduction is 1%, the number needed to treat is 100. You would have to treat 100 people to get that one person to benefit. And you can see that in this footnote here on the Lipitor ad where they say this means in a large clinical study, 3% of the people in the placebo group got a heart attack and only 2% in the treated group had a heart attack. So actually it's only a 1% absolute risk reduction. It's actually 1.1% as it turns out if you look more deeply into the numbers. The question I want to answer then is, well, what is the source of this disagreement between me and the people who say, no, they're safe and effective? Well, are we looking at contradictory statistics? Well, we're probably actually looking at the same statistics. Most of the studies show that the relative risk reduction of statins is between 25% and 50% over long periods over people at high risk. Could be that the person making the comment is confusing relative risk reduction and absolute risk reduction. I'm not sure that actually happens all that much, though. A lot of times I do have people telling me, oh, no, the absolute risk reduction is 1%. That's true in certain contexts, but it's not true in all contexts. And unfortunately, because of the word absolute and absolute risk reduction, people think that that is the benefit that everybody gets from taking the statins. And that's not exactly true. And we're going to see why as we go a little deeper. I think the most likely reason that we disagree is that we're disagreeing on what constitutes effective and what constitutes safe. For example, if a person avoids a heart attack, well, then it was effective for them. If a person dies of rhabdomyolysis, then it wasn't safe for them. So I went to this website called the NNT.com, and you can go to it. There'll be a link in the description. You can go to the search bar and type in statins, or you can just go with the links that I give, and you actually get 4 results because they're going to look at 4 different populations of patients and see what are the numbers needed to treat. In other words, how many people would we have to treat with statin therapy for one of them to benefit? And the figures that are given were eye-opening. First, let's look at how they rate things. They do some color-coded rating where green says there's clear evidence of patient-important benefits that clearly outweigh any associated harms. And I take exceptions with how this is sometimes interpreted. They give it a yellow if the data is not conclusive, a red if the benefits and harms are either equal or equivocal, ambiguous, or that the benefits don't outweigh the harms. And then they give it a black rating if this is just a harmful drug. All the statin ones came out as either green or red, so we're going to look at them in a little more detail. They also give narrations along with just the numbers. You can look at the numbers, but there are short narrations. They're easy to read, and I recommend that if you go and explore this database at this website that you actually read the short descriptions that come along with them. First, we're going to look at this population, and that is using statin therapy on patients with low risk of cardiovascular disease. They found that there was no mortality benefit in that case, and this is from a meta-analysis from a lot of different clinical trials. They went out and they looked at a whole conglomeration of these things and saw that there was no mortality benefit for people who are at low risk. Now, you might argue we don't give statins to people at low risk, and I'm going to get back to that. You would have to treat 217 people, and they didn't give a time frame with this, but since they were talking about 10-year risk, I would imagine that it's 10 years. You would have to treat 217 people for 10 years to avoid one non-fatal heart attack. You would have to treat 313 people for that time to avoid a stroke. But there's this other concept besides number needed to treat, and that is number needed to harm. It's analogous. the number needed to harm is 21. In other words, 1 out of every 21 people is going to be harmed from muscle damage. Now, this is a group of relatively healthy people, so we have to bear that in mind. And the number needed to harm was 204 for developing type 2 diabetes. Now, I did a video on statins and type 2 diabetes, and I think they missed the point when they're looking at just the occurrence of new onset type 2 diabetes, because that's kind of an artificial point. In short, I think insulin resistance is the more important thing to look at. It's more detailed than whether you've gone over the trip point of saying, oh, you now have diabetes. If you already have diabetes, then statins aren't going to give you diabetes. You already have it, but it may make your diabetes worse. And watch that video to see that. It's interesting that in this study, the NNT.com defines low risk as less than 20% 10-year risk, 1 in 5 chance or less that the person is going to have a cardiovascular event over the next 10 years. The standards of care, however, define low risk as less than 7.5%. People between 7.5% and 20% are still low risk, and these numbers sort of apply to them. I suspect that the numbers will be slightly lower for people who are at the high end of that, for people who are at 19%. These are very large numbers, and you'd have to treat a lot of people. Clearly, the number of people who are going to be harmed just by that 21, the number needed to harm for the muscle damage, outweighs the benefits here when we're talking about non-fatal heart attacks and strokes. And also recall that there is no mortality benefit. The next group we're going to look at is statin drugs given for 5 years for heart disease prevention without known heart disease. Why would we give it to people without known heart disease? Well, maybe they have some marker. Maybe they have high cholesterol. That's typically what's being done is, oh, you have high cholesterol, but we haven't confirmed there's actually any heart disease. Well, you notice they give this a red rating also. That is, they found no mortality benefit. The number needed to treat, a little bit over 100, so we're talking about an absolute risk reduction of less than 1% in these. And you notice that the number needed to harm went up to 50 for diabetes, or down to 50 for diabetes, and down to 10 for muscle damage. So in this group, there's no mortality benefit, so there's no point in taking this to prevent death. There is a minor benefit against heart attack and strokes. They had an interesting write-up in here where they said the effectiveness of the statins appear to be reproducible across studies in this group. They're using effectiveness to mean something different here, and that is they do lower cholesterol in most people who took them. Well, yes, I think that if that were our effectiveness criteria, then statins are actually very effective because in most people, they really do lower cholesterol. But then they go on to say, but very few people will avoid a heart attack or stroke by virtue of this change. And that's the whole point. Cholesterol, they tell you you have to measure it because there are no symptoms. The symptom, I guess they're trying to claim, is that you'll eventually get a heart attack. In this case, with this group, people who don't have any heart disease that's been confirmed, they merely have probably high cholesterol, then they're not getting any benefit. Very few people avoid a heart attack or stroke by virtue of this change. So in the next group of people that they study, and that is when they gave statin drugs for 5 years for heart disease prevention for people who do have known heart disease. And interestingly, they gave it a green rating. In other words, they said, yes, there are benefits to taking statins for people in this group. And here's the numbers that they came up with. The number needed to treat was 83 to prevent a death for 5 years. For 10 years, probably a bit better than that. The number needed to treat is 39 to prevent a heart attack and 125 to prevent a stroke. And again, we have the same diabetes and muscle damage dangers there. Let's just zoom in on that number needed to treat of 39 to prevent a heart attack. Well, this is saying that, yes, we're going to treat 39 people for 5 years and we're going to avoid a heart attack. There's probably 2 others who are going to have the heart attack anyway, and all the rest just weren't going to have a heart attack in the first place. And they're all bearing the burden of the financial cost and the adverse effects that may come along with it. So let's take a look at what they had to say about this. As a public health measure, this suggests that statins may have an identifiable effect, because while the chances of any one individual are small, 19 out of 20 people who took the drugs for 5 years saw no effect. When 1 million people take them, roughly 45,000 people saw some benefit. 955,000 people saw no benefit. And here's where I have to take exception. I'm not arguing that there probably are some very high risk groups where maybe it still is worthwhile for the person to consider taking statins. This green rating comes from it being looked at as a public health measure. Yes, treat millions of people, save tens of thousands of people's lives. And from the public health perspective, that is actually a good deal. Not so much of a good deal for the individual. And the other exception I have to take here is, how did they come up with 45,000? That's 4.5%. Well, that NNT of 39 is about 2.5%. What they did was, if you add 1 out of 39 plus 1 out of 125 plus 1 out of 83, that does come out to about 4.5%. But I have to believe that some of the mortality benefit overlaps with the prevention of heart attacks. So the actual benefit, these are some of the same people, is not going to be as high as 4.5%. It's probably closer to 3.5% for these people with known heart disease. Okay, an absolute risk reduction of 3.5%. We're getting into an area where it's a value judgment whether it's appropriate for the individual. I personally don't see a 3.5% benefit, given that I'd have to put up with a lot of different adverse effects that were seriously degrading my quality of life. Then it's not worth it for 3.5%. Somebody else may legitimately feel that it is worth it. So we always have to keep that in mind when we're talking with somebody about that. Are they coming from a different perspective? We can't tell them they're wrong if they feel this is effective enough for them. The final group was statins for acute coronary syndrome, and we have to define what acute coronary syndrome is. And it's a term that describes a range of conditions related to sudden reduced blood flow to the heart, including a heart attack and unstable angina. And when I read their write-up for this description, they seem to be talking about people who are given statins when they're in the hospital for this. And the claim there is that there's just no number needed to treat that could be calculated because there was no benefit whatsoever to doing this. So this is a practice that maybe doesn't really belong out there. I have a hard time believing that completely. I would have expected that this would actually be given a yellow rating, that it's just too hard to track this down with any detail. If this were the only data point that I had to make a decision on taking a statin or not, I would actually be kind of scared that I don't have enough information, and I would have given this a yellow rating. Next, let's look at some of the analysis that was done for these various different groups. And under caveats, in one of the groups, they had said that virtually all of the major statin studies were paid for and conducted by the respective pharmaceutical company. A long history of misrepresentation of data and occasionally fraudulent reporting, and I would also add to this suppression of data. If you saw my video on Statin, you can hear about that. That suggests that these results are often more optimistic than subsequent data produced by researchers and parties without a financial stake in the results. Also, harm from these drugs is difficult to predict because harms are often difficult to anticipate and often poorly tracked, and that's that suspected adverse drug reaction database that I talked about when I went over the Statin market withdrawal. Such findings often come up years after new drugs have been on the market, and I think that's what's happening. We're in this feedback loop where many doctors are convinced that statins are perfectly safe, and they either intentionally or subconsciously suppress patient reports on adverse effects. They also go on to say, it's a point of interest that this review notes important and large discrepancies in the results of trials performed with lesser and greater methodologic rigor. As one may expect, statistical benefits of statin medications were considerably and consistently greater in trials that did not explicitly use methods such as blinding and allocation concealment. The findings suggest that benefits of these medications may be strongly exaggerated, and in some cases created by basically the setup of the clinical trial. And we know that's the case when it comes to using a clinical trial that wasn't designed to track adverse effects, trying to use that study to make any conclusions about adverse effects, because quite often there's a run-in period and patients who find that they have adverse effects that they can't tolerate drop out of this study. Well, you can't use the remaining people to say, oh, here's the adverse effect rate. You have to consider all the people who dropped out. Quite often, they don't even track why a person dropped out. They may have moved out of the area. They may have adverse effects. There's a number of reasons. The bottom line is there's not a single answer to the question, are statins safe and are statins effective? We have to actually look at the population or the individual that we're applying that to. You'll never know if an individual who didn't have a heart attack was actually saved by the statin. I actually walk with a gentleman once a week who has been on statins for 25 years. He had a heart attack at age 58 and he hasn't had one since then, and he is now 83. By my calculation, back of the envelope sort of thing, there's probably a 2 out of 3 chance that he was going to have a heart attack. He didn't. Was he one of the 1/3 who was lucky? Or was he actually a beneficiary of statins? There's no way of knowing. If you have adverse effects, then you know it's harming you. So those are unfortunately the situations we find ourselves in. So that's what I've got. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topics or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.